The courthouse looked like a giant stone monster that morning. Its tall pillars and wide steps made ordinary people feel small. Among the crowd walking up those steps was Rose Chen. Nothing about her caught anyone's eye. She wore a simple gray suit that had clearly been worn many times before. In her hands she carried an old notebook with pages sticking out from all sides. Rose was 43 years old with tired eyes that had seen too many late nights. As a cleaning lady at the local community college, she worked hard hours that left her body aching. But every night, after tucking her 2 children into bed, she would sit at her small kitchen table under the flickering light and read until her eyes burned. Case number 47293, Chen versus Lakeside Properties, called out the court officer in a bored voice. The big courtroom fell quiet, except for the soft shuffling of papers. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted in their seats. Up at the front, Judge William Porter didn't even look up. He just kept writing something, his gold pen scratching against paper. Judge Porter had a reputation around town. People called him the Hammer because he came down hard on regular folks who couldn't afford fancy lawyers. His black robe always looked freshly pressed, and his silver hair was perfectly combed to the side. The diamond pin on his tie probably cost more than Rose made in 3 months. On the other side of the courtroom sat a young man in an expensive suit. His hair was slicked back and his shoes shined like mirrors. He was the lawyer for Lakeside Properties, and he had a smug smile on his face. He had won cases like this hundreds of times before. "I see the defendant is representing herself today," Judge Porter finally said, looking up from his papers. His eyes moved over Rose like she was a spot on his clean floor. "No attorney, Ms. Chen?" Rose stood up straight. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. "No, Your Honor, I will be speaking for myself today." A few lawyers waiting for their cases exchanged looks and small smiles. One even chuckled under his breath. Everyone knew how this would end. Regular people who tried to be their own lawyers, in Judge Porter's courtroom, always left in tears. The judge sighed loudly, making sure everyone heard his annoyance. "Very well, I hope you understand what you're doing." He glanced at the property company's lawyer. "Mr. Reynolds, please present your case." Mr. Reynolds stood up smoothly. His voice filled the room like he owned it. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter. Ms. Chen has failed to pay her rent for 3 months. The lease agreement is clear. Lakeside Properties has the right to evict her. We have all the proper documentation right here." He held up a thick folder of papers, each one in a clear plastic sleeve, each one perfectly arranged. "Furthermore," he continued, "Ms. Chen has violated several other terms of her lease. She has been keeping a pet despite our no pets policy. She has made unauthorized modifications to the apartment, and there have been noise complaints from neighbors." Judge Porter nodded along to everything the lawyer said. His mind seemed already made up. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," the judge said when the lawyer finished. Then he turned to Rose with a look that said he was already bored. "Ms. Chen, what do you have to say for yourself?" Rose stood up slowly. Her old notebook was open in front of her. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, with colored tabs sticking out from the sides. What nobody in that courtroom knew, not the smirking lawyers, not the bored judge, not even the confident Mr. Reynolds, was what Rose Chen did every night after her long shifts cleaning floors and scrubbing toilets. For the past 11 years, Rose had been teaching herself law. It started the day she lost her first apartment and nearly lost her children because she didn't understand the legal system. The memory of that day burned in her mind like a hot coal. She had promised herself it would never happen again. Every night she would walk to the public library after her shift. The librarians knew her well, the quiet cleaning lady who always asked for law books. She would photocopy pages she couldn't afford to check out. She would watch free legal lectures online at the library computers. She would take careful notes in her old notebook, organizing everything with colored tabs made from scraps of paper. Rose had created her own law school at her kitchen table, but standing there in the courtroom, nobody saw any of that. They just saw a small woman in an old suit, probably about to be thrown out of her home. The judge was already reaching for his gavel, ready to move on to the next case. "Ms. Chen?" he prompted again, his patience clearly running thin. "Do you Have anything to say in your defense? Rose took a deep breath. She looked down at her carefully organized notes one last time. Yes, Your Honor, she said. I have quite a lot to say. The courtroom had no idea what was about to happen. The courtroom was so quiet now that you could hear the old clock on the wall ticking. Everyone watched Rose Chen, waiting for her to stumble over her words or break down in tears. That's what usually happened when people tried to fight against big companies without a lawyer. Rose opened her notebook carefully. Her fingers moved to one of the blue tabs she had made from an old cereal box. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, like a small bell ringing in the silent room. Your Honor, before we discuss the claims about missed rent payments, I need to address a more basic problem. The eviction notice I received doesn't meet legal requirements. Mr. Reynolds, the property company's lawyer, rolled his eyes. Judge. Porter leaned back in his big chair, already looking bored. Ms. Chen, we're not here to nitpick about paperwork, the judge said. Rose didn't back down. With respect, Your Honor, this isn't nitpicking. In the case of Wilson against Parkview Apartments from 2018, the court clearly established that notice requirements under state law, Section 4732, cannot be ignored, even if the lease says otherwise. The judge's mouth opened slightly. He wasn't expecting legal cases to come from this cleaning lady's mouth. Mr. Reynolds stopped smirking and started flipping through his perfect folder of papers. Furthermore, Rose continued, turning to another page in her notebook. The notice I got didn't include a detailed list of what I supposedly owe, which goes against the State Housing Code, Section 213.4, Paragraph C. Judge Porter sat up straighter. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Rose more carefully. Ms. Chen, are you reading this from somewhere? He asked, suspicion in his voice. No, Your Honor. These are my notes from my studies. The people watching from the benches started whispering to each other. The court officer had to ask for quiet. Rose wasn't done. She pulled out 3 more pieces of paper from her notebook. Your Honor, I'd also like to point out the Rivera case from 2020 where the court ruled that... She went on to explain another legal case in simple but accurate terms. Her accent was noticeable when she said some of the harder legal words, but her understanding was perfect. As Rose spoke, something strange happened. The judge stopped looking annoyed and started looking interested. Mr. Reynolds, who had been so confident just minutes ago, was now frantically whispering to his assistant. And about those missed rent payments, Rose said, pulling out a folder of her own. It wasn't fancy like Mr. Reynolds' folder. It was made from an old manila envelope with rent written on it in marker. I have all my bank records here. They show every payment was made on time. She handed copies to the court officer, who passed them to the judge and to Mr. Reynolds. As you can see, Rose explained, I paid by money order on the 1st of each month. I always get a receipt. Here they are. Mr. Reynolds jumped to his feet. Your Honor, these receipts could be for anything. They don't prove... They have Lakeside Properties stamp on them, Rose pointed out calmly. And the property manager's signature, see here? She pointed to a spot on the paper. Judge Porter examined the receipts closely. His eyes moved from the papers to Rose and back again. Something had changed in the way he looked at her. The annoyance was gone, replaced by something like curiosity. Mr. Reynolds tried again. Even if the rent issue is unclear, there are still the lease violations about pets and unauthorized modifications. About that, Rose interrupted, pulling out another tab from her notebook. Section 17 of the State Housing Code says that no pet policies cannot be enforced against support animals with proper documentation. I have a letter here from Dr. Lee about my daughter's support cat. She handed over another paper. This one had a doctor's letterhead. As for the modifications, she continued, I have written permission from the building manager to install grab bars in the bathroom after my mother broke her hip. Here's the email. The courtroom had gone from quiet to completely silent. Nobody could believe what they were seeing. This ordinary-looking woman in her worn-out suit was taking apart the property company's case piece by piece, using real laws and actual evidence. Mr. Reynolds was no longer smug. His face had turned slightly red, and he kept adjusting his expensive tie like it was suddenly too tight. Judge Porter was now leaning forward, fully engaged. His eyes studied Rose with growing, interest. After she finished explaining about the noise complaints, which turned out to be from a single neighbor who had a history of complaining about everyone, the judge raised his hand to stop her. "Ms. Chen," he said, his tone completely different. "Now, I have to ask, where exactly did you study law?" Rose looked down at her worn notebook, then back up at the judge. For the first time, there was a tiny hint of pride in her eyes. "At my kitchen table, Your Honor, after my children go to sleep." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Porter had to bang his gavel for order. "And you learned all of this? How?" the judge pressed. Rose's answer was simple. "The public library has law books. The librarians let me read them after my cleaning shift. I've been doing it for 11 years now." Judge Porter exchanged a look with his clerk. Even Mr. Reynolds had stopped objecting and was staring at Rose with a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. Nobody in that courtroom would ever look at a cleaning lady the same way again. "Did you say 11 years?" Judge Porter asked, leaning forward in his chair. Rose nodded, her hands resting on her notebook. "Yes, Your Honor. I started the day after I lost my first apartment." The judge looked like he wanted to ask more, but Mr. Reynolds jumped in quickly, trying to take back control of the situation. "Your Honor, regardless of Ms. Chen's hobby, the fact remains that Lakeside Properties has legitimate concerns about—" "I'm not finished addressing the evidence, Mr. Reynolds," Rose said, her quiet voice somehow cutting through his louder one. She flipped to another page in her notebook, this one marked with a red tab made from an old greeting card. "Your Honor, I'd like to discuss the actual condition of my apartment, which Mr. Reynolds claims I damaged." She pulled out several photographs from her folder. "These pictures show what my apartment looked like when I moved in 4 years ago. The photos weren't fancy, just regular pictures taken on an old phone. But they clearly showed peeling paint, a cracked window, and water stains on the ceiling. And here's what it looks like now," she continued, pulling out more photos. These showed the same rooms, but everything was fixed up. The walls freshly painted, the window replaced, the ceiling clean. "I did these repairs myself after asking the property manager for fixes 3 times in writing. Under the State Housing Code Section 43.2, tenants may make necessary repairs after giving proper notice and may deduct reasonable costs from rent." Judge Porter's eyebrows shot up as he studied the before and after pictures. Then he looked at Rose with new eyes. "Ms. Chen, this is quite thorough," he said. Mr. Reynolds tried again. "Your Honor, if I may—" "Just a moment, counsel." "Judge," Porter said, holding up his hand. The lawyer's mouth snapped shut. The judge was now completely focused on Rose. "Ms. Chen, you mentioned earlier that you've been studying law for 11 years. May I ask why you never pursued formal education in this field? You clearly have an aptitude for it." A sad smile flickered across Rose's face. "Your Honor, night school costs money. Cleaning jobs don't pay much. My children need to eat more than I need a diploma." The simple truth of her words hung in the air. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman in the back wiped her eyes. "Besides," Rose added, pulling out another document from her folder, "I wanted to show you this next. It's the original inspection report from the City Housing Department from last year." She handed it to the court officer, who passed it to the judge. As Judge Porter read it, his eyes widened. "This report shows the building failing 7 safety codes," Rose explained, "including lack of proper fire exits, faulty wiring in the common areas, and mold in the basement. I contacted the housing department after my neighbor's child got sick from the mold." Mr. Reynolds stood up so fast his chair squeaked against the floor. "Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant to the case at hand." Judge Porter fixed him with a stern look. "Mr. Reynolds, I will decide what's relevant in my courtroom." He turned back to Rose. "Please continue, Ms. Chen." Rose nodded gratefully. "The most important part is on page 3, Your Honor. The inspector noted that Lakeside Properties had been cited for these same violations 2 years earlier, but never fixed them." The judge flipped to page 3, reading carefully. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear pages turning. "And then if you look at the date they filed for my eviction," Rose said, her voice still calm and steady, "it was exactly 1 week after the city gave them this final warning about the violations." Understanding dawned on Judge Porter's face. You're suggesting this eviction is retaliatory? Rose nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Under State Law Section 64.5, landlords cannot evict tenants for reporting housing code violations. It's called retaliatory eviction and it's illegal. Mr. Reynolds was on his feet again. Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client would never— Does your client own other properties in the city, Mr. Reynolds? Rose asked, turning to face him. Directly for the first time. The question caught him off guard. Yes, of course they do. Lakeside Properties manages several buildings. Rose turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I spoke with tenants in their other buildings. They've had similar experiences. She pulled out a stack of papers. These are signed statements from 12 other tenants describing the same pattern. Judge Porter's face had changed completely. Gone was the bored, dismissive look he'd worn at the beginning of the hearing. Now his eyes were sharp and focused, his mouth set in a grim line. Ms. Chen, he said, his voice softer now, how did you find time to gather all this evidence? You mentioned you work as a cleaning lady? Rose's shoulders straightened slightly. I work from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. at the college, Your Honor. Then I clean offices from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. After my children are in bed, I have from 9 p.m. until whenever I can stay awake. And when exactly do you sleep? The judge asked. A small laugh escaped Rose's lips the first time she had shown any lightness in the courtroom. Sleep is a luxury, Your Honor. Justice is a necessity. Those words seemed to echo in the high-ceilinged courtroom. Several attorneys waiting for their cases were now watching with open interest. The court reporter's fingers had stopped over her machine for just a moment before she remembered herself and continued typing. Judge Porter studied Rose for a long moment. Then he did something unusual. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, suddenly looking very human himself. Ms. Chen, he said finally, in 30 years on the bench I've rarely seen such thorough preparation from seasoned attorneys, let alone from someone without formal training. May I ask how you learned to prepare a case like this? Rose looked down at her worn notebook, touching its cover lightly with her fingertips. When she looked up, there was both pride and pain in her eyes. 11 years ago, I stood in a courtroom, like this one. I didn't understand anything that was happening. I lost my home, I almost lost my daughter. The judge spoke words I didn't know, the landlord's lawyer used laws I couldn't understand. Her voice grew stronger. I promised myself that would never happen again. Not to me. Not to my children. Judge Porter nodded slowly, a new respect visible in his eyes. And so you taught yourself the law? Yes, Rose said simply. One book at a time. Judge Porter cleared his throat. The mood in the courtroom had shifted completely. What had started as a routine eviction case had turned into something no one expected. Mr. Reynolds, the judge said, turning to the property company's lawyer, do you have any response to Ms. Chen's evidence about the housing violations and the timing of this eviction notice? The lawyer stood up, his confidence now visibly shaken. The perfect crease in his pants and his slicked-back hair couldn't hide the uncertainty in his eyes. Your Honor, my client was not aware of these alleged violations when they began the eviction process. His voice didn't have the same ring of authority it had earlier. Rose shook her head slightly. From her folder, she pulled out one more document. This is a certified mail receipt showing that Lakeside Properties signed for the housing inspector's report. She handed it to the court officer. As you can see, it was signed by the property manager 3 days before they filed for my eviction. Mr. Reynolds' face turned a shade redder. He whispered urgently to his assistant, who began frantically searching through their files. Judge Porter examined the receipt, then looked back at the property company's lawyer. Mr. Reynolds, this appears to directly contradict what you just told the court. The lawyer tugged at his collar. Your Honor, I was not personally aware. You are representing your client in this courtroom, Judge Porter interrupted, his voice now stern. It is your responsibility to know the facts of the case before making statements to this court. A murmur ran through the audience. Some people were even smiling now. Rose kept her face calm, but her hands had stopped trembling. Judge Porter turned, Back to Rose. Ms. Chen, do you have anything else you'd like to present? Rose nodded. Just one more thing, Your Honor. She pulled out a final document. This is from the tenant meeting last month. It shows that 15 tenants in our building have experienced similar problems: repairs not being made, false claims about late rent, sudden rent increases not in the lease. We've all signed it. As the judge reviewed this final piece of evidence, Mr. Reynolds made one last attempt to salvage his case. Your Honor, even if there were some misunderstandings about the property conditions, the fact remains that... Judge Porter held up his hand, stopping the lawyer mid-sentence. Mr. Reynolds, I've heard enough. He set down the tenant meeting notes and looked directly at the property company's representative who was sitting behind the lawyer. Based on the evidence presented today, not only am I dismissing this eviction case, but I am also ordering an investigation into Lakeside Properties practices. His voice was firm and clear. Ms. Chen has presented compelling evidence of what appears to be a pattern of retaliatory actions and possible fraud. The property representative's mouth fell open. Mr. Reynolds looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under him. Furthermore, Judge Porter continued, I am forwarding these housing code violations to the city prosecutor's office for review. The conditions Ms. Chen has documented may constitute criminal negligence. Rose sat very still, her hands resting on her notebook. She hadn't expected this outcome. She had hoped to save her apartment, but this was something much bigger. Judge Porter wasn't finished. And Mr. Reynolds, I expect a full accounting of all the rent payments Ms. Chen claims to have made. If the property records don't match her receipts, that's a very serious matter. The lawyer nodded stiffly, gathering his once pristine papers, which now looked rumpled and messy compared to Rose's carefully organized evidence. Court is adjourned for 15 minutes, Judge Porter announced, banging his gavel. Ms. Chen, would you please remain behind? I'd like to speak with you privately. As people began filing out of the courtroom, many glanced at Rose with new respect. A couple of the waiting tenants even gave her small nods or smiles. Mr. Reynolds hurried out with his client, their heads bent together in urgent conversation. Rose remained seated, wondering what the judge wanted to say to her. She carefully put her documents back in order, marking each with its proper tab. When the courtroom had emptied except for the court officer standing by the door, Judge Porter stepped down from his high bench. Without the height advantage, he looked more like a regular person, still in his black robe but somehow more human. Ms. Chen, he said, taking a seat at the lawyer's table across from her, I owe you an apology. Rose looked up, surprised. Your Honor? When you walked into my courtroom today, I made assumptions about you. Unfair assumptions. He folded his hands on the table. I've been a judge for almost 30 years, and I like to think I'm fair. But today you taught me that I still have blind spots. Rose wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't expected this kind of honesty from a judge. Your knowledge of the law is remarkable, he continued. But even more impressive is your determination, the hours you must have put in, the dedication. I did what I had to do, Rose said simply. For my children. For myself. Judge Porter nodded. Most people wouldn't have done what you did. They would have given up. Rose thought about that for a moment. When you have no choice, you find a way. The system isn't built for people like me to win, so I had to learn the system. You did more than learn it, the judge said with a small smile. You mastered it. For the first time all day, Rose allowed herself a real smile. It transformed her tired face, making her look younger, lighter somehow. Ms. Chen, have you ever considered pursuing this professionally? Judge Porter asked. With your knowledge and experience, you could help many people in situations similar to yours. Rose laughed softly. Every day, Your Honor. Every single day. She looked down at her worn notebook, then back at the judge. But cleaning ladies with 2 jobs don't usually become lawyers. Judge Porter studied her thoughtfully. Perhaps that's exactly the problem with our legal system. He paused, seeming to make a decision. What if there was a way? What if I could help? Rose's eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? There are programs for non-traditional students, scholarships, part-time options. He pulled a business card from his pocket and wrote something on the back. This is the name of a colleague of mine who runs the community law program at the state university. I'd like you to call her. Rose took the card carefully, as if it might disappear. I don't understand. Why would you help me? Judge Porter looked around the empty courtroom, then back at Rose. Because justice works better when people like you are on both sides of the bench. He stood up, straightening his robe. And frankly, Ms. Chen, you'd make a damn good lawyer. As Rose walked out of the courtroom a few minutes later, she held the judge's card tightly in her hand. People who had watched her case were waiting in the hallway, some wanting to ask her questions about their own housing problems. For the first time in her life, Rose Chen wasn't invisible. For the first time, people were looking to her for answers. And for the first time, she believed she might actually have them. 6 months had passed since that day in court. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the county courthouse as Rose Chen walked through the front doors. But this time, everything was different. She wasn't wearing her old gray suit anymore. Today she had on a new navy blue one, not expensive but clean and well-fitted. Her hair was neatly styled and she carried a proper briefcase instead of her old folder held together with tape. But the biggest change wasn't on the outside. It was the way she walked, with her head high and her steps sure. The security guard at the metal detector smiled at her. Morning, Ms. Chen. Good morning, Lou, she replied with a smile of her own. Rose wasn't at the courthouse as a defendant today. She was there as a paralegal in training for the Housing Rights Coalition. The business card Judge Porter had given her that day had led to a meeting, which led to an application, which led to a scholarship for part-time classes at the community college. Rose still worked as a cleaning lady at the college in the mornings, but her afternoons were now spent at the coalition office, helping other tenants fight unfair evictions. Her evenings were filled with classes instead of that second cleaning job. As she walked down the courthouse hallway toward courtroom 3, where a group of tenants were waiting for her help with their case, Rose passed by Judge Porter's courtroom. Just as she did, the door opened, and the judge himself stepped out. Ms. Chen, he said, looking pleased to see her. I was hoping I might run into you today. Your Honor, Rose said with a respectful nod. How are you? Very well, thank you. He glanced at her briefcase and new suit. The coalition keeping you busy, I see. Rose nodded. Very busy. Since the news story about lakeside properties, we've had more calls than we can handle. The news story had been quite something. After Judge Porter had forwarded the evidence to the city prosecutor, investigators had discovered that lakeside properties had been falsifying repair records for years. They had collected rent increases for improvements that were never made. They had even been charging tenants for utilities that should have been covered by the building. The whole thing had exploded into the biggest housing scandal the city had seen in decades. 3 buildings had been put under new management, and the owners of lakeside properties were now facing criminal charges. And it had all started with one cleaning lady who taught herself law at her kitchen table. I heard you started classes, Judge Porter said as they walked together down the hall. Yes, 2 nights a week. Rose couldn't help the pride that crept into her voice. My professor says I'm at the top of my class. I'm not surprised, the judge said with a smile. Though I imagine you know more about housing law than some of your teachers. Rose laughed softly. Maybe, but there's still so much to learn. Contract law, criminal procedure, constitutional theory. Her eyes lit up as she spoke about these subjects that once would have seemed impossibly out of reach. How are your children adjusting to the changes? The judge asked. Rose's smile softened. They're proud. My son tells everyone his mom is going to be a lawyer. My daughter helps quiz me on legal terms before my tests. They reached the door to courtroom 3, where Rose needed to meet the tenants she was helping. You know, Judge Porter said before they parted, the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court is coming to visit next month. She's very interested in programs that help non-traditional students enter the legal profession. I've told her about you. Rose's eyes widened. About me? Yes, the judge nodded. Your story matters, Ms. Chen. Not just to you and your children, but to our whole legal system. We need more people like you. People who understand what it's really like to face these challenges. Rose wasn't sure what to say. 6 months ago, she had been a cleaning lady fighting to keep her apartment. Now a judge was telling her that the Chief Justice wanted to meet her. Thank you, Your Honor, she finally managed. For everything. Judge Porter shook his head. No, Ms. Chen. Thank you. You reminded me why I became a judge in the first place, to help ensure that justice is available to everyone, not just those who can afford expensive lawyers. As Rose turned to enter the courtroom, the judge added one more thing. Oh, and Ms. Chen, I heard from Professor Watkins that you've been offered a full scholarship for the paralegal certification program. Rose stopped, her hand on the door. How did you know? I just got the letter yesterday. Judge Porter's eyes crinkled at the corners. Let's just say I may have written a rather persuasive recommendation letter. Before she could respond, he continued down the hall to his own courtroom. Inside courtroom 3, a group of nervous-looking people sat in the front row. They were all tenants from a rundown apartment building on the east side of town. They looked the way Rose had felt that day 6 months ago, scared, confused, and certain they were going to lose. Good morning, Rose said as she approached them, setting her briefcase on the table. My name is Rose Chen from the Housing Rights Coalition. I'm here to help you fight this eviction. An older woman looked up at her doubtfully. You're our lawyer? Not yet, Rose said with a gentle smile. I'm still in school, but I know housing law very well, and I'll be working with a lawyer from the coalition on your case. Will we win? Asked a young man with a baby sleeping against his shoulder. Rose opened her briefcase and took out her notebook, not the old one with the homemade tabs, but a new one, properly organized with color-coded dividers. Still, she had kept the old one. It sat on her desk at home as a reminder of where she had started. I can't promise a win, Rose told them honestly, but I can promise that no one will dismiss you or trick you with legal words you don't understand. And I can promise that we will fight with everything we have. The tension in their faces eased a little. They recognized something in Rose that gave them hope. She wasn't some fancy lawyer who couldn't understand their lives. She was one of them, but with knowledge they needed. As Rose began explaining their rights as tenants, using simple words that everyone could understand, she thought about how much had changed. She had walked into a courtroom 6 months ago, expecting to lose everything. Instead, she had found a new path. The judge who had tried to humiliate her had become her biggest supporter. The system that had seemed designed to defeat her was now her professional field of study, and the legal knowledge she had gathered in lonely hours at her kitchen table was now helping others fight their own battles. Rose Chen, once invisible, was now impossible to ignore, and this was just the beginning of her story.